In a world where power often drowns out compassion, one man believed his title made him untouchable. He stood behind polished podiums and spoke of leadership, all while hiding the arrogance that simmered beneath his smile. But pride has a way of blinding the powerful, and when he humiliated a nurse who had given her life to caring for others, he didn't just make a mistake, he ignited something he could never control. That nurse, a woman who had once stayed past every shift, who treated the broken and the forgotten, had once saved a biker's life. She didn't ask who he was or what patch he wore, she only asked if he could breathe. And though the world moved on, that man never forgot her face. So when news of her humiliation reached him, it wasn't politics that answered, it was loyalty. It was the sound of engines rumbling to life, the growl of brotherhood waking from its sleep. Because kindness, once given, never truly dies. And the man who believed power made him invincible was about to learn. There are forces far stronger than fear, and louder than his name. Before you even think about clicking away, ask yourself this: when power tries to crush decency, what side would you stand on? Because this story isn't just about a nurse and a mayor, it's about every time someone was told to stay quiet when doing what's right. If you've ever believed that kindness should never cost someone their dignity, then don't just watch. Stand with us. Hit subscribe right now, not for me, but for every Sarah out there who still believes compassion is stronger than corruption. And when you stay till the end of this story, you'll see what loyalty really looks like. Not in speeches, not in politics, but in the roar of 400 hearts that refuse to stay silent. So go ahead, prove it. Subscribe, stay, and ride this story to the very end. Trolls scroll past. The brave stick around. There's a kind of quiet that only small towns know, the kind that hums beneath the rhythm of everyday life. You can almost hear it in the way coffee is poured at the corner diner, or in the way the same handful of faces greet each other each morning like clockwork. The air carries the scent of old oak trees and gasoline from trucks that have seen 3 generations. Here, the days don't rush, they drift. It's the sort of town where people still wave when they pass, where the hardware store owner knows the name of your dog, and where Friday nights belong to the high school football team. At first glance, everything feels safe, almost frozen in time. The post office still closes for lunch. The grocery clerk still bags your bread on top, and everyone, without fail, stops by the diner with the red vinyl booths. There's comfort in the sameness, a rhythm that wraps around the people like a familiar blanket. You can feel it in the laughter spilling out of the barbershop, in the gossip traded between waitresses, and in the steady hum of life that never seems to change. But beneath that calm, beneath the smiles and friendly nods, there's something else, something that doesn't quite fit the postcard image. It lingers like the flicker of that old hospital sign at the edge of town, the one that buzzes and fades just before it shines again. The people here don't talk about it openly, but everyone knows that in a place this small, some rules are written in whispers, and others are enforced in silence. Because this town, as warm and welcoming as it seems, has its unspoken hierarchy, its hidden lines of power that no one dares to cross. City Hall sits on the hill, not grand, not imposing, but heavy with the weight of names that have run things for generations. The same families who built the roads, funded the parades, and decided who gets second chances. People say it's just the way things are. You don't make waves here. You play your part, smile when you're told, and hope that when the storm comes, it doesn't have your name on it. Still, there's a kind of beauty in the balance, the way good people carry on, keeping the peace even when they know the cost. You can see it in the faces of the nurses walking home after a long shift, in the shopkeepers sweeping their steps, in the old men playing checkers outside the firehouse. They keep the heart of this town beating, even as power rests quietly in the hands of a few. For now, everything seems calm, a picture of small-town peace framed in golden light. But beneath the quiet streets and friendly smiles, something is waiting. A change. A reckoning. Because not everyone here plays by the same rules, and sometimes, even the smallest act of kindness can set off a chain no one sees coming. Her name was Sarah Whitmore, 45 years old, steady as a heartbeat, and known by nearly everyone who'd ever stepped through the doors of the county hospital. She'd been there most of her life, walking those same linoleum floors with quiet purpose, her soft-soled shoes barely making a sound. To the patients, she was the calm that entered the room after chaos. To her co-workers, she was the one who never lost her patience, even when the world around her did. Sarah wasn't the kind of nurse who looked at a chart before seeing the person. She looked into their eyes first, listened before she spoke. To her, the uniform didn't make her important, the people did. It didn't matter if they wore leather or linen, whether they came in with polished shoes or dusty boots. She treated them all the same. Bikers, drifters, mayors, farmhands, every soul that needed care found the same warmth in her presence. There was something rare about the way she worked, something deeply human. She'd sit by a patient's bedside long after the monitor steadied, her hand resting gently on theirs, whispering, "You're safe here." And she meant it. In those words, there was no judgment, no hesitation, only an unshakable belief that compassion could heal more than medicine ever could. Many nights, she stayed past her shift, catching up on notes no one would read, refilling cups of water, checking pulses in rooms others had forgotten. When the younger nurses asked her why, she'd simply smile and say, "Because someone has to care." It wasn't a slogan for her, it was a way of life. And maybe that's what made her so respected, even by those who'd never met her. In a town divided by names and influence, Sarah never saw sides. She saw people, bruised, scared, human. The kind of person who could look past the tattoos, the patched jackets, the worn-out eyes of a man who'd seen too much and still find something worth saving. She never asked who he was. Never asked where he came from, or what mistakes he carried. The only question that ever left her lips was, "How can I help?" And in a world that often measures worth by power, that simple question, that small act of grace, would soon become the spark that changed everything. The night of the crash had started like any other along Highway 41, quiet, endless, and wrapped in the hum of distant engines. The kind of road where men ride to clear their thoughts, to outrun their ghosts. But somewhere between the bend and the bridge, a tire caught gravel, and a wall of steel met asphalt. What followed was the kind of silence that only comes after violence, heavy, unreal, broken only by the crackle of a dying engine. Sarah had been finishing her shift when the call came in. She didn't wait for backup. She grabbed her bag and drove out herself, headlights cutting through the fog. When she found him, the world around him was chaos. Flashing red lights, twisted metal, the scent of oil and rain. He lay there on the roadside, his leather jacket torn, blood pooling dark beneath him. Most people would have seen danger, a stranger, a biker, someone to fear. Sarah saw a man fighting for his life. She dropped to her knees without hesitation, steady hands pressing where they needed to, voice firm but gentle. "Stay with me," she whispered. "You're safe. Just breathe." He tried to speak, his voice gravel in pain, but she shushed him softly, focused on keeping his heart steady. Time lost meaning there, the road, the sirens, the noise. It all faded until there was only the rhythm of breath and her voice anchoring him to life. As the paramedics arrived and lifted him onto the stretcher, he reached for her wrist, weak but deliberate. His eyes met hers, bloodshot, defiant, and strangely clear. With a rasping breath, he said, "If I ever make it out of this, I owe you." Sarah only smiled, brushing the dirt from his hand. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "Just get better." But he didn't forget her face. Through the haze of pain and flashing lights, her calm had burned itself into his memory, the woman who never asked what patch he wore or what trouble he'd seen. She didn't see a biker, she saw a human being worth saving. And for a man who'd spent most of his life being looked at like something less, that moment meant everything. He would carry that promise, quiet, unspoken, long after the road healed and the scars faded. Mayor Richard Dalton was the kind of man small towns often produce, polished, persuasive, and practiced in the art of pretending. He'd been in office for nearly a decade, long enough for his name to feel less like a title and more like a brand. His photo hung in every civic building, his quotes painted on banners about community progress and shared values. To the public, he was the smiling face that showed up at every ribbon cutting, every charity drive, every Sunday pancake breakfast. But those who looked closely knew, the smile never quite reached his eyes. Dalton carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who believed he owned the ground he walked on. His words were smooth, his handshake firm, but beneath the practiced charm was something colder, entitlement. To him, people were steps in a staircase he'd already climbed, and the town was a chessboard that always bent to his rules. When his cousin was admitted to the hospital one late afternoon, Dalton arrived expecting doors to open and voices to lower. His staff followed close behind, papers in hand, faces tight with the kind of fear that comes from proximity to power. Nurses stepped aside as he entered the ER, his polished shoes echoing on the tile. He found Sarah at the nurses' station, tired but focused, clipboard in hand. "Mayor Dalton," she greeted him politely, her voice steady. He didn't return the courtesy. Instead, He gestured sharply toward one of the treatment rooms. "My cousin's been waiting. He needs attention now." Sarah glanced at the monitor board. A dozen patients in serious condition, 2 in surgery, 1 child struggling to breathe. She kept her tone calm but firm. "Sir, we're working through critical cases first. He's stable. We'll treat him as soon as possible." Dalton's expression froze, his jaw tightening. "Do you have any idea who you're speaking to?" Sarah didn't flinch. "A man asking me to break protocol while others are fighting for their lives." The words hung in the air, quiet but heavy, the kind that pierced through polished arrogance. Around them, the hum of hospital life carried on, machines beeping, phones ringing, but in that moment, something had shifted. Dalton's smile returned, but this time it was thin and dangerous. "You'll regret this," he said softly, his voice carrying more threat than volume. And though Sarah didn't know it then, that single act of standing her ground had just placed her squarely in the path of a man who was never used to hearing the word no. The air around them tightened, the calm of the hospital replaced by something sharper, unseen, the first tremor before the storm. The confrontation began with a shout, the kind that makes a quiet hallway stop breathing. Mayor Dalton's voice cut through the hospital corridor, sharp and commanding, his polished tone gone. Sarah stood her ground, still holding the patient chart she'd refused to alter. The fluorescent lights above flickered faintly as tension rippled through the air. Nurses nearby slowed their steps, pretending to busy themselves with paperwork, but their eyes told the truth. Everyone was watching. Dalton's face burned red, his composure unraveling in front of the very people who had always bowed to him. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he barked, his voice bouncing off the sterile walls. Sarah didn't raise hers. She didn't need to. "I know exactly who you are," she said quietly. "And it doesn't change what's right." For a moment, silence. Then before anyone could move, he stepped forward, quick, violent, and his hand struck her across the face. The sound echoed, sharp and hollow, louder than anything the room had ever heard. Her clipboard slipped from her hands, papers scattering across the floor like snow. The hallway froze. Monitors beeped in the distance, muffled under the weight of shock. No one moved. No one spoke. Sarah stood there, cheek flushed red, eyes wide but unbroken. Dalton stared back, his breathing ragged, realizing too late that his mask had fallen. He straightened his jacket, forcing a smirk that didn't fit his face. "You forgot your place," he hissed. Then he turned and walked away, the echo of his footsteps swallowed by the hum of machines and whispered disbelief. No one dared to stop him. Not then. The nurses exchanged glances, torn between fear and fury, while Sarah slowly bent to gather the scattered papers, one by one, with trembling hands but steady resolve. By nightfall, the story spread through the hospital like wildfire. Some dismissed it as rumor, others as exaggeration. But when the local news ran the story, a brief mention buried between traffic reports and weather, one man watching from a distant bar recognized the woman on the screen. The nurse who had once saved his life. And as the screen faded to black, the hum of an engine filled the silence, low and rising. If you believe no one deserves to be humiliated for doing their job, hit like right now. Let's stand with Sarah. Morning came heavy and gray, the kind of morning that feels like it knows something you don't. The hospital corridors that once felt like home now hummed with unease. Conversations paused when Sarah walked by. Smiles that used to greet her turned into uneasy glances. The slap had changed more than her face. It had cracked something invisible in the air, something the hospital couldn't afford to acknowledge. Before she could even process what had happened, she was called into a meeting. 3 administrators waiting behind a long table, papers neatly stacked, their voices rehearsed and clinical. They didn't look angry, they looked uncomfortable, like people forced to do something they'd rather not, but wouldn't dare resist. "Sarah," one began, "this whole situation has gotten out of hand." She sat straight, her hands clasped in her lap. "Out of hand," she said quietly. "He hit me." Another administrator, older, leaned forward, lowering his voice as if reasoning with a child. "We understand you're upset. But Mayor Dalton is an important figure in this community. This kind of story could damage the hospital's reputation." She blinked, trying to understand. Damage the hospital? Her voice broke slightly. "He assaulted an employee." The third administrator sighed. "Look, Sarah, no one's questioning your dedication. But we all need to think carefully about how this looks. You could lose your pension, your career, everything you've worked for. Maybe it's best to let this go." The room fell silent except for the ticking clock on the wall. They weren't asking her to tell the truth, they were asking her to disappear behind it. Sarah rose slowly, her voice trembling but resolute. "You're asking me to pretend it didn't happen." No one answered. The silence was their confession. By that afternoon, the whispers had turned into headlines. The local news ran a short segment: "Tension at County Hospital, Nurse Accused of Provoking Mayor During Dispute." The story was crafted with careful words and missing truths. They called her unprofessional, hinted that she'd been emotional, suggested that maybe she'd misunderstood. The mayor's office declined to comment, which only made his innocence sound more certain. When the hospital suspended her pending internal review, the official memo praised her years of service even as it erased her dignity. That evening, she went home to silence. No calls. No visitors. Just the hum of her refrigerator and the echo of her own heartbeat. The bruise on her face had already begun to fade, but the weight behind her ribs only deepened. She set her keys down on the counter beside the morning paper, the headline staring back at her in bold letters: "Local Nurse Accused of Provoking Mayor." Her hands shook as she touched the page. The photo was small, a still from her hospital ID, cropped tight, her smile frozen in a moment that now felt like another life. She sat at the kitchen table, the light above flickering weakly, her coffee untouched. 4 years, this had been her sanctuary, the little home she'd built on double shifts and sacrifice. But tonight, it felt foreign, almost hostile. The air was thick with disbelief, betrayal, and something darker, helplessness. She'd always believed that doing the right thing meant something. That truth had a place in this world, that decency still counted for something. But in the span of a day, she had learned how fragile that belief could be. Tears came quietly, not the kind that release pain, but the kind that confirm it's real. She pressed her palms to her face and whispered into the empty room, "What am I supposed to do now?" Outside, the town carried on as if nothing had happened. Streetlights blinked on, engines passed, laughter spilled faintly from the diner down the street. The world hadn't stopped for her pain, it never does. But somewhere far beyond the hospital, beyond the reach of politics and polished smiles, a different kind of silence was breaking. Someone somewhere had seen that same headline, and remembered her face. The night had settled deep over the edge of town, where the roads ran quiet and the air smelled of oil, smoke and rain. Inside a weathered brick building with a flickering neon sign, a few men sat scattered around a pool table, their laughter low, familiar and tired. The walls were lined with old photographs, rides, rallies, faces long gone, and in the corner hung a framed patch, red and white against black leather, the mark of a brotherhood that had seen both light and shadow. Red sat beneath it, his hands rough and scarred, the years etched deep across his face. His beard had gone gray at the edges, his hair thinner, but his presence still carried weight. Time had softened his anger, but not his memory. The television on the wall droned in the background, another local news story, the kind he rarely paid attention to. But that night, the words caught him mid-sentence. County Hospital Nurse Suspended After Dispute with Mayor Dalton. He turned his head slowly toward the screen. The reporter's voice faded, but the image froze him where he sat, a woman's face, weary but dignified, framed by a headline that didn't match the truth. "That's her," he said quietly, almost to himself. His jaw tightened, his hand gripping the arm of his chair until his knuckles turned white. "That's the nurse." The room fell silent. A few of the men looked up, recognizing the tone, the weight in his voice that came from something deeper than anger. One of them spoke. "You sure?" Red nodded once, eyes still locked on the screen. She didn't look at the leather or the patches. She didn't care what colors I wore, or what people called me. I was bleeding on the side of the road, and she just helped. The men exchanged glances, the kind that carry history, not the kind you explain, but the kind you feel. They all knew what that meant. In their world, loyalty wasn't a word, it was a bond sealed in moments like that. Red leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the light from the television flickering across his face. For a long time, he'd kept to himself, leaving the noise and chaos of his past behind. But some debts don't fade, and some promises echo long after they're spoken. He looked up toward the wall, at that old Hell's Angels patch, framed and faded but still gleaming like a piece of his soul he could never quite let go. The room around him felt suddenly alive again, charged with an old familiar electricity. She stood up to a man with power, Red said quietly. Now she's standing alone. No one replied. They didn't need to. The silence that followed was thick with understanding, with a kind of loyalty that doesn't have to be spoken out loud. Red's eyes narrowed slightly, his decision already made long before the words left his mouth. She helped one of us, he murmured. Now it's our turn. And with that, the balance of the story began to shift. Red sat alone long after the others had gone home. The clubhouse had grown quiet, the kind of silence that settles heavy after a storm brews in the heart. The only sound left was the low hum of the old beer fridge and the soft ticking of the clock above the bar. He stared down at his phone, the reflection of the dark screen catching the weight in his eyes. It had been years since he'd made a call like the one he was about to make. Years since the old crew had heard his voice outside of birthdays and funerals. But tonight wasn't about nostalgia. Tonight was about a promise. He took a slow breath, thumb hovering over a name that hadn't lit up his screen in a long, long time. Then, without hesitation, he pressed it. The line clicked, and a familiar voice answered, gruff and cautious. Red? You still alive, old man? A dry laugh. Alive enough. He hesitated, the humor slipping away. Listen, I need a favor. You remember that nurse I told you about? The one who pulled me off the pavement that night. Yeah. What about her? She's in trouble. The kind you don't walk away from. The pause on the other end was long, but when the man spoke again, his voice carried steel. Where and when? Red's answer came low, steady. Soon. I'll make the calls. And he did. One after another. Voices from the past, men who'd scattered across states and years but still carried the same code, loyalty above all. Some he hadn't seen in a decade, others he'd only heard about through whispers. But when Red spoke, they listened. She helped one of us, he said simply. Now it's our turn. He didn't need to explain more than that. The men on the other end knew exactly what that meant. Old engines were checked. Dust was wiped off jackets that hadn't been worn in years. Wrenches turned. Tanks filled. And across miles of highway and memory, a movement began to rumble awake. The air around the clubhouse changed, a pulse of purpose humming through the walls. Red stood by the doorway, phone still in his hand, listening to the faint sounds of engines roaring to life in far-off garages. The night had a heartbeat again, one made of chrome and thunder. For the first time in years, Red smiled. Not the grin of an old outlaw, but the quiet satisfaction of a man who knows he's about to make something right. Meanwhile, across town, Sarah moved through the quiet of the hospital one last time. Her locker stood open, half empty. A few personal photos, a stethoscope, her name tag, all laid out like fragments of a life she hadn't planned on leaving behind. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if each item carried more weight than she could bear. The hospital she devoted her life to had turned its back on her, and the echo of that betrayal hung heavy in the air. She folded her scrubs neatly, placed them in a paper bag, and ran her fingers once over the cold metal of her locker door before closing it for the last time. Her reflection stared back from the dull surface, tired, bruised, but not broken. As she walked down the corridor, the fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. She passed nurses who pretended not to see her, doctors who offered sympathetic nods but said nothing. The world around her felt drained of sound, drained of meaning, until faintly, through the silence, came a different rhythm entirely. A distant growl. Low. Familiar. Like thunder rolling somewhere far away. She didn't know it yet, but the first engines had already started. Back at the clubhouse, Red leaned against his bike, the night wind tugging at his worn leather jacket. One by one, headlights flickered to life around him. First 2, then 5, then a dozen. The men arrived without questions, without speeches, their eyes saying everything words couldn't. Red looked around at the faces, older, harder, but bound by something unbreakable. He nodded once, solemn and sure. This isn't revenge, he said quietly. This is respect. The others nodded back, the engines around them growling like beasts waking from a long sleep. And somewhere in the distance, as the first convoy rolled out into the dark, a woman sat alone, believing she'd been forgotten. She wasn't. If you've ever stood up for someone who couldn't fight back, comment "Justice rides with me." Because sometimes justice doesn't come from courts or titles. Sometimes it rides in on two wheels, carried by those who still remember what a promise means. Mayor Dalton appeared on the local evening broadcast the way he always did, polished, confident, and absolutely certain of his own control. The camera lights softened the lines on his face, his tailored suit perfect, his smile rehearsed. He leaned back in his chair as the reporter asked the question everyone had been whispering about for days. Mayor Dalton, can you comment on the alleged incident at County Hospital involving Nurse Sarah Whitmore? Dalton chuckled, just barely, a short, dismissive sound that made the question feel beneath him. Alleged incident? He repeated smoothly, his voice carrying that familiar blend of charm and condescension. I don't recall any incident. I've always had great respect for our healthcare workers. This is simply a misunderstanding that's been blown out of proportion. He smiled, the kind of smile meant to end conversations, not invite them. And just like that, the station moved on, weather, sports, tomorrow's charity event, as if nothing had happened. But the town wasn't buying it this time. Not after the footage of Sarah's tear-streaked face had circulated online, not after the whispers from hospital staff reached the bars, the diners, the churches. His arrogance didn't quiet the fire. It fed it. People began to talk, quietly at first, then louder. He's lying, someone muttered in the grocery line. He thinks he can get away with anything. Social media posts multiplied, the story spreading beyond county lines. And somewhere out on the open road, far from the mayor's carefully controlled world, a different kind of story was forming, one that couldn't be spun or silenced. Engines thundered across state borders, chrome catching the afternoon light. The sound rolled like a living storm. Red rode at the front, face set, eyes hidden behind dark lenses, the wind tugging at his jacket. Behind him, miles of bikers stretched down the highway, veterans, truckers, old friends, and strangers who'd simply heard what happened and decided it mattered. Each one carried something Sarah had lost, dignity, respect, belief in justice, and they carried it for her. The convoy moved like a living heartbeat, steady and unbreakable. On overpasses, people gathered to watch, holding up phones, waving flags. Some didn't even know the full story, they just knew what it stood for: loyalty, decency, and the idea that nobody, not even a mayor, was above accountability. As the roar grew louder, a small boy stood at the edge of a dirt road, waving with both hands, his baseball cap crooked, his face lit up with awe. Red caught the movement out of the corner of his eye and gave a small nod, raising two fingers off the handlebars in silent acknowledgement. This, he murmured beneath his breath, voice rough but steady, this is bigger than one slap. Because by now, it wasn't just about Sarah. It wasn't even about Dalton. It was about every person who'd ever been silenced, every act of cruelty swept under a rug of power. The roar behind Red grew stronger, carrying a message that no press conference could bury. While Dalton smirked into cameras, certain his words had buried the story, 1,000 engines were rewriting it, 1 mile at a time. Dawn broke slow and pale, the kind of morning that seemed to hold its breath. A thin mist rolled over the highway, the world hushed and waiting. Then from somewhere deep within the fog came the sound, low at first, then building, the steady growl of engines rising like thunder from the earth itself. It was not one engine, not 10, but hundreds. The rhythm of loyalty made mechanical, echoing off the asphalt and into the open sky. 400 bikers stretched across the morning horizon, their chrome catching the first light like shards of fire. They rode in formation, tight, deliberate, unbreakable, each one carrying the same purpose in their chest. Dust kicked up behind them, a cloud of motion that could be felt as much as seen. The rumble shook windows, turned heads, and made hearts pound in every town they passed. Local news crews scrambled to keep up. Reporters spoke in voices trembling with disbelief. They've come from 5 states, one gasped over the roar, her hair whipped by wind, camera struggling to focus on the line of riders that seemed endless. No one knows who organized it, but they're all headed to the same place. Behind their helmets and goggles, faces stayed solemn. These weren't men and women looking for chaos, they were bringing something far more powerful. A message. A reckoning wrapped in respect. Some had ridden all night, through rain, through exhaustion, because they'd heard the story and knew it mattered. At the front rode Red, his eyes locked on the road ahead, his old leather vest patched with history. Around his neck hung a small silver cross, dull from years of wear, a quiet reminder of promises that still meant something. Every few miles, he looked into his side mirror, the reflection of hundreds following him, the reflection of something bigger than any one person. In the quiet edges of town, curtains parted, children pressed faces to glass, old men tipped their hats. The roar wasn't frightening, it was cleansing, the kind of sound that makes you believe change is possible when good people refuse to be silent. On a quiet street at the edge of the city, Sarah stirred awake. The sound reached her before she understood it. At first, it was a distant hum, then a vibration through the floor, a resonance that grew until it filled the room. She sat up slowly, confusion giving way to disbelief. She moved to the window, the morning light breaking through the blinds in thin lines. Her breath caught in her throat. Outside, stretching down the street, engines idled, 400 strong men and women in leather vests, their patches gleaming, their heads bowed in quiet unity. No one spoke. No one needed to. The roar of their machines was enough. Sarah's hand went to her mouth, tears spilling freely before she could stop them. These weren't strangers. They were the living echo of the kindness she'd once given freely, now returned 1,000-fold. For a moment, she stood frozen, overwhelmed by the sight, the sound, the sheer weight of it all. Then slowly, she reached up and pulled open the blinds completely. And in that single gesture, 400 riders lifted their heads in unison. The engines roared again, not in fury, but in honor. Some deaths, it seemed, were written not in words, but in the roads that led back home. The engines quieted one by one, leaving behind an almost sacred silence. The bikers parked in long straight lines outside the hospital, 400 strong, their chrome and leather glinting beneath the late morning sun. They hadn't come with fury. They hadn't come to destroy. They had come to stand, steady, silent, and unyielding, for something that mattered. Across their handlebars hung hand-painted signs, words written in bold, unpolished strokes: respect those who care. Hands off our healers. Justice for Sarah. Each one carried the heartbeat of the people who made them, rough hands that had known both mercy and pain. Inside the hospital, blinds lifted and faces appeared at the windows. Doctors, nurses, janitors, all frozen by the sight. None of them had ever seen anything like it. The roar that had rolled through the town had finally reached its destination, not with violence, but with purpose. Police cruisers pulled up at the edge of the crowd, lights flashing but sirens silent. Officers stepped out, uncertain, hands hovering near radios. They expected anger. They found respect. Red dismounted and stood tall, his helmet tucked beneath his arm. He nodded to the officers, calm and sure. "We're not here to cause trouble," he said simply. "We're here to remind this town what respect looks like." One of the officers, a younger man with tired eyes, hesitated before giving a small nod. "Then we'll let you do that," he said quietly. From the hospital entrance, a ripple of movement, nurses gathering, staff whispering. And then, through the glass doors, Sarah appeared. She stopped on the steps, her heart pounding, unable to process what she was seeing. 400 riders stood before her, lined shoulder to shoulder, heads bowed. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Tears welled up before she could stop them. These weren't just men and women on motorcycles. They were gratitude made flesh. They were her patients, her protectors, her proof that goodness still mattered. Red met her eyes from across the crowd, gave a slow nod, the same steady nod he'd given her once before on a dark highway years ago. Sarah stepped forward, one trembling hand pressed to her chest. "Why?" she managed to whisper, her voice cracking. Red's answer carried softly across the still air. "Because you didn't ask who we were," he said. "You just helped." The moment hung there, heavy and beautiful, like a prayer no one had expected to say out loud. Sarah's tears turned into a shaky smile, pride washing through her in waves. For the first time since that terrible day, she didn't feel small or silenced, she felt seen. Around her, people began to step out of the hospital, nurses in scrubs, patients leaning on canes, even a few who'd once doubted her. They stood beside the bikers, shoulder to shoulder, the line between them disappearing entirely. Some moments in life shout. Others hum quietly, but echo forever. This one roared. If you believe kindness deserves protection, hit subscribe. Trolls won't. Inside the hospital, the news had already spread. The roar outside, the gathering of bikers, the quiet strength of a nurse standing her ground. Word reached Mayor Dalton before anyone else dared to tell him directly. He was in his office, pacing, watching the scene unfold on a muted television. The camera panned across the endless line of motorcycles, the banners, the crowd swelling in support of Sarah. His face drained of color. He turned away from the screen and snapped at his assistant. "Get the car ready. Now." Outside, the chants had begun to rise, low at first, then building. The hum of hundreds of voices carried up the hospital walls, mixing with the steady growl of idling engines. Cameras from local stations lined the sidewalks, reporters narrating the moment with wide-eyed disbelief. "It appears the mayor has yet to make a statement," one of them said. "But the people here aren't waiting for words." Dalton slipped out a side door, hoping to disappear unnoticed. His polished shoes clicked on the pavement as he moved quickly toward the parking lot, head down, jaw clenched. But it was too late. A dozen cameras turned in unison, flashes cutting through the air like lightning. "Mayor Dalton! Mayor Dalton!" reporters shouted, their microphones thrust forward. "Is it true you struck a nurse? Do you have anything to say to the people standing outside for her?" He raised a hand to shield his face, his charm gone, his words lost. "No comment," he muttered, pushing past them, his voice tight with panic. That's when a figure stepped out from between two parked bikes, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing an old leather vest heavy with patches faded from time and sun. A veteran, his stance unshakable, eyes steady. Dalton froze. Cameras swung toward them. The man's voice carried through the air, calm and cold. "You can't slap your way out of this one." The line hit like a hammer. Dalton's jaw twitched, but there was nothing left for him to hide behind. No podium, no speech, no camera to control. Only the truth staring back at him through the lens of every reporter in town. He stammered, "You don't understand." But no one listened. The crowd had found its verdict, and silence replaced the noise. Behind him, the hospital doors opened again, and Sarah stepped outside, not to confront him, but to stand in the open light, beside the people who refused to let her be erased. The veteran turned his back on the mayor and joined the line of bikers once more. Dalton stood frozen, caught between flashing bulbs and the roar of justice he could no longer command. Somewhere, a voice from the crowd shouted, "You're done!" And others took it up until the chant rose around him, rolling like thunder, "You're done! You're done!" Dalton's carefully built image, the handshakes, the smiles, the power, crumbled in real time, broadcast for all to see. The man who thought himself untouchable had been brought down not by politics or scandal, but by a single act of decency that refused to stay buried. As he stumbled toward his car, cameras followed, recording every faltering step, the fall of pride, the price of arrogance, the moment justice finally found its voice. The noise of the crowd softened to a hum as Red stepped forward. The rumble of engines fell away, the clatter of cameras and chatter of reporters fading until there was only the low wind moving through the crowd. He stood at the edge of the hospital steps, the morning sun spilling across his weathered face, his old leather vest creased and cracked from a lifetime on the road. For a long moment, he didn't speak. He just looked around, at the nurses, the bikers, the townsfolk gathered shoulder to shoulder, and then at Sarah, standing a few steps behind him, her eyes red but steady. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the gravel of years, but also something deeper, the kind of truth that doesn't need to shout to be heard. "She didn't see criminals," he said slowly, his gaze sweeping across the faces before him. "She saw people. That's it. People worth saving. Maybe that's what this town forgot." A hush fell, heavy and sacred. He took a breath, the kind that holds the ache of every mile, every scar. "When I was lying on that road, I wasn't a man most folks would stop for. I'd made mistakes. Plenty of them. But she didn't ask what I'd done. She didn't ask what patch I wore. She just helped. And she saved my life." He paused, the memory flickering behind his eyes, then turned toward Sarah. "You told me once I didn't owe you anything." His voice cracked just slightly, the weight of it catching him off guard. "But you were wrong. I owe you more than I can ever repay. We all do." The crowd stood silent, men who'd spent their lives behind tough exteriors now wiping at their eyes, nurses holding hands, a few whispering soft prayers. Then, as if on cue, the first clap broke the stillness. One person, then another. And suddenly, applause rippled through the air like a wave, strong, honest, unstoppable. Sarah's breath caught. She'd spent weeks feeling invisible, betrayed by the very people she'd given everything to. But here, surrounded by hundreds who had come not for spectacle but for her, she finally understood that kindness was never wasted. It came back, even if it had to ride 1,000 miles to find its way home. She stepped forward, tears shining on her cheeks, and before words could form, she wrapped her arms around Red. He held her tight, the crowd erupting again, louder this time, applause, cheers, the deep rumble of engines starting in salute. Red leaned down, his voice barely audible over the roar. "Told you I owed you," he said. Sarah laughed through her tears, nodding against his shoulder. And for that moment, standing there in the golden light of redemption, it didn't matter who they had been or what lines had divided them before. A nurse and a biker, two people who'd met on opposite sides of a broken world, had reminded an entire town what humanity really looks like. And somewhere in that rising sound of applause and engines, the promise he'd once whispered on a dark roadside had finally been kept. The days that followed moved slower, as if the town itself was trying to catch its breath after everything it had seen. The story spread far beyond the county line, local stations, state headlines, then national news. The footage of 400 bikers standing silently outside a small-town hospital was impossible to ignore. And in the middle of it all there was Sarah, the woman whose simple act of courage had cracked open the polished shell of power. Mayor Dalton tried to hold on at first. Statements were issued, lawyers called, excuses rehearsed. But it was already too late. The people had made up their minds. The same voices that once whispered in fear now spoke in unison, demanding his resignation. The town council meetings filled with faces that hadn't shown up in years. Teachers, veterans, nurses, mothers, all standing shoulder to shoulder, refusing to look away. Within a week, Dalton appeared before the cameras one last time. His hair was still perfect, his tie still straight, but his eyes were hollow. He read his statement in a monotone voice, thanking the town for the opportunity to serve, before announcing his resignation effective immediately. The words were meant to sound dignified, but to everyone watching, they sounded like the closing of a door that should have been shut long ago. At the hospital, something changed too. For the first time in years, the air felt lighter. The administration issued an apology, though their words were carefully measured. More importantly, they reinstated Sarah, with full honors, back pay, and a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. But Sarah didn't care for the politics of it. She just wanted to go back to what she loved most. On her first day back, she walked through the familiar halls with a quiet smile. The same floors she had once walked in shame now welcomed her home. The same faces that had looked away now met her eyes with warmth and gratitude. In the break room, a bouquet of wildflowers sat on the counter with a note, for the one who never forgot what it means to care. The riders. And just like that, life began to find its rhythm again. A soft montage unfolded across the days that followed. Sarah leaning over a patient's bed, her gentle smile returning, an elderly man gripping her hand in thanks, a child handing her a crayon drawing that read, "Thank you, Nurse Sarah." Laughter returned to the hospital halls, quiet and genuine. Even the flickering sign outside, the one that had buzzed uncertainly for years, now shone steady, as if refusing to dim again. In town, people began to greet one another differently. Conversations felt a little more honest, a little less afraid. The story had changed them. Power had been humbled, and kindness, the kind that asks for nothing, had found its rightful place again. And somewhere in the background, the narrator's voice returned, soft and reflective, tying the story back to where it began. This was a place where everyone knew everyone, the voice said. And for a while, they forgot what that really meant. But now, they remember. As Sarah stepped outside after another long shift, the sun dipped low over the quiet streets. For the first time in a long time, the town felt at peace, not perfect, not unscarred but awake. And in that calm you could almost hear it, the faint echo of engines in the distance, a reminder that kindness, once given, never truly fades. In the months that followed, something remarkable took root from the chaos, not in the halls of government, not in headlines or speeches, but in the hearts of ordinary people. What had started as a stand for one woman became a movement that reached far beyond the town limits. Across the country, bikers, nurses, veterans, and everyday citizens came together, inspired by what they had seen. It began with a single idea from Red and his brothers, a way to make sure no nurse would ever stand alone again. They called it the Sarah Fund, a support network for healthcare workers who faced assault or abuse on the job. Donations poured in from every corner of the map, from hospitals, biker chapters, and strangers who simply wrote, "For Sarah. For respect." Within weeks, the fund had grown large enough to offer legal aid, counseling, and financial support for those who needed it. But more than that, It became a symbol, proof that kindness and courage could still spark real change. Sarah's name became a quiet rallying cry, not for fame or pity, but for dignity. She tried to stay humble about it, going about her days as she always had, tending to patients, teaching younger nurses, never speaking much about what had happened. But one afternoon, after her shift ended, she found someone waiting for her outside the hospital. Red stood there by his bike, hands tucked into the pockets of his worn leather jacket, that same calm strength in his eyes. Age had deepened the lines on his face, but the respect in his gaze hadn't faded. "You didn't have to come all this way," Sarah said, smiling softly. Red shrugged, pulling something from inside his jacket, a small weathered frame wrapped in cloth. He handed it to her gently. When she unwrapped it, her breath caught. Inside was his old Hell's Angels patch, faded and frayed around the edges, the one that had hung on the clubhouse wall all those years. "You'll always have a brotherhood," he said quietly. "No matter what road you're on." Sarah blinked back tears, touched the glass, and nodded. "And you'll always have a home here," she whispered. For a moment, neither spoke. The sun dipped low behind them, painting the world in gold and amber. Red gave a small nod, started his bike, and with a deep familiar roar, rode off toward the horizon. One by one, other engines joined him, faint at first, then building into a soft, fading thunder that rolled across the hills. Sarah stood there watching until the sound was gone, her heart full, her spirit unshaken. Because in the end, kindness had done what power never could. It had united strangers, humbled arrogance, and built something that would last long after the engines quieted. If you believe kindness is power, share this story. Comment respect rides forever. Let's remind the world what loyalty looks like.